It was a quiet evening in a small Midwestern town when the unthinkable happened. Two teenagers, ordinary on the outside, troubled on the inside, made a choice that would alter countless lives forever. What began as a night of hanging out, riding bikes, and talking about frustrations turned into a crime scene that shocked a community, devastated a family, and ignited a legal battle that continues to spark debate years later. The victim was a classmate, someone they knew, someone who trusted them enough to walk with them down a darkened street. In the span of a few minutes, that trust was betrayed in the worst way imaginable. By the time police arrived, the teen was gone, his life cut short by those barely old enough to drive. The two young killers were arrested within hours. Their names splashed across local newspapers, their mugshots staring out from the evening news. For their classmates, it was almost impossible to believe. These weren't faceless monsters from headlines. They were kids who sat in the same cafeteria, walked the same halls, and laughed in the same classrooms. The question of justice. From the very beginning, the case was about more than just what happened that night. It raised a haunting question. What should society do when children commit adult crimes? The prosecution moved swiftly, charging the teens as adults. They argued that the crime was premeditated, violent, and cruel. If a 16-year-old could plan a murder, they said, then that 16-year-old should face the same punishment as anyone else. But defense lawyers painted a different picture. They argued the teens were products of broken homes, untreated trauma, and immature brains that couldn't fully grasp the permanence of their actions. They urged the court and the public not to see them as killers but as kids who made a catastrophic mistake. It was a battle between justice and mercy, and every detail of the case was fuel for both sides. Community reactions. The town was divided. Some residents demanded life sentences, insisting that anyone capable of taking a life at such a young age was beyond redemption. Others, often parents themselves, struggled with the idea of throwing away two young lives forever. Vigils were held for the victim, but whispers about the killers spread in hallways, churches, and grocery stores. Could they ever be rehabilitated? Should they ever walk free again? For the victim's family, the answer was clear. Their child's life had been stolen, and no second chance would bring him back. For the killers' families, it was an unbearable contradiction. Loving their children while knowing those same children had destroyed another family forever. The sentencing. After months of testimony, expert witnesses, and emotional statements, the jury delivered their verdicts. Guilty. The two teenagers were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Not life without parole, but decades behind bars, long enough that they would spend their youth and young adulthood locked away. At the time, many believed the story was over. Justice had been served, the killers punished, and the victim's family given closure. But as the years passed, something unexpected began to happen. Legal battles over juvenile sentencing brought the case back to the surface, reopening wounds the community thought had healed. A changing legal landscape. In the decades that followed, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down landmark rulings on juvenile sentencing. Judges were told to consider the immaturity of teenagers, their capacity for change, and the possibility of rehabilitation. Life without parole for juveniles became increasingly rare. Suddenly, cases like this one weren't just closed chapters in old court files. They were reopened, re-examined, and re-argued. The teen killers, now grown adults in their 30s, were back in courtrooms, this time asking for something their victim would never have: a second chance. The debate begins again. For victims' families, parole hearings reopened old wounds. They had stood in court years earlier, heard guilty verdicts, and tried to move forward. Now they were forced to sit in courtrooms again, reliving the trauma as lawyers argued that the killers had changed. For the defense, it was a moment to present evidence of rehabilitation. Prison records showing good behavior, educational certificates, and testimonies from chaplains and counselors who insisted the young men were no longer the angry teenagers who committed murder. The question once again hung in the air. Do paroled teen killers deserve a second chance? Or does true justice mean keeping them locked away forever? Closing this chapter, the story of these two teenagers is just one of many across the country. Their crime changed lives, destroyed families, and left a permanent scar on their community. But it also became part of a larger conversation about justice, redemption, and whether society can, or should, believe that a killer who acted at 16 can grow into a different person at 36. In the next chapter, we'll step inside the parole hearings themselves, where victims' families clash with defense lawyers, and where the question of justice versus mercy plays out in real time. When a teenager is convicted of murder, their world changes in an instant. Instead of classrooms and sports fields, they are thrust into correctional facilities where survival often becomes the top priority. Chapter 2 takes us inside prison walls, where the line between punishment and rehabilitation blurs, and where some teen killers claim to have found redemption. Life behind bars. For many young offenders, prison becomes both a punishment and a place of forced growth. At 15, 16, or 17, their lives are suddenly stripped of freedom. Days are regimented by counts, lockdowns, and institutional schedules. Inmates who entered the system as vulnerable youths are quickly forced to adapt, sometimes hardening into career criminals, and other times channeling their energy into education, religious faith, or counseling. Some institutions offer GED programs, vocational training, or therapy aimed at reshaping young minds before they are lost completely to the prison cycle. Others, however, operate in environments where violence and survival instincts overshadow any chance of real change. The struggle for identity. One of the most overlooked aspects of teen incarceration is identity. While their peers outside are going through milestones, graduating, forming relationships, starting careers, incarcerated teens are locked in suspended development. By the time they reach adulthood, years behind bars have already shaped who they are. Some embrace remorse, seeking forgiveness and trying to make amends. Others deny responsibility, claiming their convictions were unfair or that they were victims of circumstance. These conflicting narratives raise the question: when they say they've changed, is it genuine growth or simply the desire for parole? Stories of change. Case Study 1. A 16-year-old convicted of a brutal stabbing later became a model prisoner, earning degrees in sociology and criminal justice while counseling younger inmates. His transformation convinced some parole boards that he was no longer a threat. Case Study 2. Another teen murderer, incarcerated at 15, joined gang activity inside, committing violent acts that mirrored the crime that put him behind bars. His parole was denied multiple times, highlighting how not all inmates reform. Society's skepticism. Despite stories of transformation, the public remains wary. Families of victims often reject the notion of change, arguing that no amount of good behavior can erase a murder. To them, prison is not about rehabilitation, it's about justice and permanent accountability. This tension between public safety, victim justice, and second chances creates the central debate. Should the actions of a teenager define them forever, or can prison truly reform someone capable of such violence? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Parole hearings are often described as mini-trials, but for families of victims, they can feel like reopening an old wound. For the convicted teen killer, however, it's their one chance to argue they have changed, matured, and deserve freedom. In this chapter, we step into the tension-filled atmosphere of parole hearings, where every word can determine the rest of a person's life. The setting of parole hearings. Unlike a criminal trial, parole hearings are more intimate, yet no less intense. A panel of board members sits in judgment, reviewing years of prison records, psychological evaluations, and personal testimonies. On one side sits the inmate, often dressed in prison-issued clothing, rehearsing apologies and pleas for redemption. On the other side sit victims' families, prepared to relive the trauma by describing the loss that changed their lives forever. Every statement, every emotion is weighed heavily. The decision isn't just about one life. It's about justice, safety, and the memory of the crime. Inmates' pleas for freedom. Former teen killers often stress their age at the time of the crime, arguing that they were immature, impulsive, and incapable of fully understanding their actions. They highlight years of good behavior behind bars. No infractions, participation in rehabilitation programs, educational achievements, or mentoring other inmates. Many admit guilt and express remorse. Some break down in tears, saying they've carried the weight of their actions for decades. Others, however, stumble, appearing insincere or rehearsed, causing parole boards to question their credibility. Families of victims speak out. Perhaps the most emotional part of any parole hearing comes from the families of victims. Parents, siblings, and spouses step forward, voices trembling, to recount how the crime destroyed their lives. Some argue passionately that a murderer, no matter how young at the time, should never be free. Others describe sleepless nights and constant fear, knowing the person responsible for their loved one's death might walk the same streets again. A few rare cases show forgiveness, where family members support parole, believing the offender has truly changed. These conflicting voices add complexity to the already difficult decision. Societies split judgment. When a parole board grants release, communities often react with outrage. News headlines highlight the killer's freedom, sparking debates about justice versus mercy. Supporters argue that holding someone forever accountable for actions committed as a child is inhumane. Critics counter that some crimes are simply too severe to forgive. The parole board is caught in the middle, weighing an offender's transformation against the irreversible pain of victims' families. Turning point. For teen killers seeking parole, these hearings are the most important days of their lives. Some walk away devastated after being denied, told to wait years before reapplying. Others step out of prison gates into a world they barely recognize, with a second chance at life, but under the shadow of their past. For those rare teen killers who are granted parole, stepping outside prison walls does not mean stepping away from their past. Freedom comes with new challenges, old labels, and the constant question: can society ever accept them again? The first days of freedom, walking out of prison after years or even decades, can feel surreal. Paroled offenders often describe the outside world as unrecognizable. Technology has advanced, cities have changed, and even small things like using a smartphone or ordering food at a restaurant can feel overwhelming. But alongside that shock comes another, heavier reality. Reintegration isn't just about adapting to new technology. It's about learning how to exist in a society that doesn't forget or forgive easily. Stigma that follows. Even after serving their time, paroled teen killers carry an invisible sentence. Stigma. Employers hesitate to hire them. Neighbors whisper. News outlets remind communities of their crimes. For some, every introduction comes with a dreaded disclosure of their past. Some parolees change their names or move across the country to escape the weight of their history. Others attempt to rebuild in their hometowns, but face constant backlash from those who believe they should never have been released. Stories of struggle and redemption. Case Study 1. A former teen killer released after 25 years struggled for months to find work. Eventually, a nonprofit specializing in helping ex-inmates gave him a chance. Today, he works as a counselor for at-risk youth, hoping to prevent them from repeating his mistakes. Case Study 2. Another parolee found freedom unbearable. Shunned by society and haunted by guilt, he fell into addiction, ultimately violating parole and returning to prison. These contrasting paths highlight the fragile balance between opportunity and relapse. Can they truly reform? Psychologists argue that teenagers are neurologically different from adults. Their brains, especially the regions controlling judgment and impulse, are still developing. This science has been used to argue that many teen killers, given the right support, can indeed change. But critics ask, does that matter to the families who lost someone? For them, no amount of rehabilitation can erase the pain, making reintegration feel like a second betrayal. Freedom under watch. Even after release, parolees live under strict supervision. Regular check-ins, curfews, travel restrictions, and drug testing mean that freedom is conditional. A single misstep could send them back behind bars. In this way, many describe life on parole as a different kind of prison, one without walls but with constant surveillance. The stories of paroled teen killers leave us with a question that refuses to be neatly answered. Can a person who took a life as a teenager ever truly pay their debt to society? The two sides of justice. On one side, there are victims' families who live every day with the absence of their loved one. To them, parole feels like justice undone. They ask, why should the person who destroyed our family get another chance at happiness when our loved one never will? For these families, no parole hearing, no apology, no act of rehabilitation can ever balance the scales. On the other side are those who believe that people, especially children, can change. They argue that punishing teenagers for life disregards human capacity for growth, maturity, and redemption. Science supports their claim, pointing to adolescent brain development and the ability to reform with the right guidance. The weight of second chances. Every parole granted to a teen killer becomes a gamble. If they succeed, finding work, building families, giving back to communities, it fuels the belief that second chances can heal. But if they fail, reoffending, spiraling into crime, or violating parole, it reignites anger, proving to critics that some crimes should never be forgiven. Society's role. This debate isn't only about individuals. It's about society itself. What does it say about us if we deny forgiveness forever? And what does it risk if we extend mercy too freely? Laws vary across states and countries, reflecting deep cultural divides over punishment versus rehabilitation. Some countries prioritize rehabilitation, releasing offenders after showing progress. Others focus on retribution, ensuring killers, no matter their age, serve life sentences without parole. Both approaches reveal the uncomfortable truth. There is no perfect solution. A case that stays with us. Perhaps the most haunting part of these cases is how they force us to look inward. When a young person commits an unthinkable act, it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Was it a moment of youthful impulsiveness or evidence of a darker nature? Should a single act, however horrific, define a person's entire life? And most importantly, can we live with the consequences of whichever side we choose? Final thoughts. The fate of paroled teen killers will always divide opinion. For some, they are proof of the human ability to change. For others, they are a painful reminder that justice may never feel complete. In the end, the debate isn't only about them, it's about us. About whether we believe in punishment without end, or in the possibility that even the darkest stories can turn toward redemption. And so, the question remains, do they deserve a second chance? Or should the past always define the future?